Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series, sponsored by the Administration for Community Living and hosted by the American Society on Aging. We'll be getting started in just a moment. The slides for today's presentation are available under the tab on your screen labeled Resources. You'll also see an additional handout there made available by our presenters. And under the tab labeled CE application here, you'll find information on how to obtain CE credit for this event. You'll have 60 days to complete a continuing education application, and it may take up to 30 days from the date of your application in order for us to process and issue your CE credit. If you are not logged in directly to this webinar, that is, if you are watching as part of a group and did not log in using an individual confirmation URL, you will not be eligible for continuing education credit because we have no way to track your online attendance. If you'd like to receive continuing education credit, please be sure you log in using a confirmation URL that you received after individually registering. If you have questions during the presentation, you can send those at any time using the questions box, and we will save those for the last 10 to 15 minutes of today's program. And now I'd like to welcome today's moderator, Sari Schumann.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for joining us today for the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar, Person-Centered Goal Discovery for People Living with Dementia. The National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series is supported by the Administration for Community Living. Before we start, Erin Long of the Administration for Community Living will provide a brief welcome. Erin?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us for this very important webinar on person-centered goal discovery. We're excited to have Leigh, Kingsbury, Shawn, Terrell, and Brian Van Buren with us to help us learn all about the process. So with that, I'll give it back to you, Sarah, so we can move forward. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. So as you heard from Erin, today's presenters are Leigh Kingsbury, Brian Van Buren, and Shawn Terrell. We are expecting Brian Van Buren to join us any moment, and we'll start with our introductions. Leigh Kingsbury has been a student and practitioner of person-centered practices since the mid-1980s. Her experience includes providing community-based services to people with disabilities and elders, many of whom communicate by using challenging actions and behavior. Her expertise includes supporting people with complex healthcare needs and using person-centered practices to support healthcare and end-of-life decision-making. Ms. Kingsbury is a board member emeritus of the Learning Community for Person-Centered Practices. She is a Learning Community Certified Mentor Trainer and a Certified Respecting Choices Facilitator. Brian Van Buren is an Alzheimer's advocate and public speaker, a board member of the Western Carolina chapter of the Alzheimer's Association, and an advisory council member for the Dementia Action Alliance. After his early onset Alzheimer's diagnosis in 2015, he reimagined himself as an advocate. Being an African American man, he felt he needed to give a face to the disease. He also feels a need to address marginalized populations such as the LGBTQ community. Brian was featured in Dr. Sanjay Gupta's latest book, Keep Sharp, Build a Better Brain at Any Age. Shawn Terrell has been working in the long-term care services and supports arena for more than 20 years. He is a health insurance specialist at the Administration for Community Living, where his primary focus is on developing person-centered planning policy, capacity and quality measurement and improvement in home and community-based services systems. He is also engaged in a number of policy development and implementation activities. Mr. Terrell is a person-centered thinking trainer in Washington, D.C. At this time, I will turn it over to our speakers for the presentation, and we will start with Leigh Kingsbury.
Thanks, Sari. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to start with just a quick review of learning objectives. You have seen these already, I think, in the registration. Just a quick reminder about what we'll be doing today. The framework for today's conversation is, pardon me, this balancing act between what we identify as important to people and what we identify as important for people. And we'll spend just a few moments of talking about those definitions. But that's really the framework for today. In addition, we are going to spend a little bit of time on one particular process and tool called a communication chart, which is a way to record somebody's communication, whether they are using words to communicate with us or other means. Pardon me. Welcome to allergy season. And the third objective today is to briefly just touch on the kind of differences between discovery, management, and everyday learning tools that are part of person-centered practices as a way to support people, again, in that framework of balancing what is important to and important for people. Again, for today's practice or today's presentation, but really in the broad practices of person-centered practices, there are some core principles that we want to be clear about, and this is what we've really built our presentation on today. The first is that it's really important to us to honor the continuum, the spectrum of the dementia journey, and recognize that we engage with people wherever they may be in that journey, right? We engage with folks in a way that makes sense for them, in a way that makes sense for their families and for their care providers, wherever they might be along that continuum and in that journey. We also acknowledge that and really recognize that people who live with dementia, the care partners and caregivers who provide support, family members, are experts in everyday life. And though it's important, we think also to recognize and honor the expertise that the system, the professional system, and those of us working in the system bring to this process. First and foremost, it's critically important that we honor and recognize that the folks who live every day with this diagnosis are the experts of the content. They are the content experts of their lives. One of the pieces of this, as I mentioned, this framework for us is about balancing what is important to the person with what is important for the person. And one of the things to remember about that is that that's not a one-off, if you will. It's not a singular event. That is a continually evolving practice that we have to do. Some days, things that are important for will take precedence. Some days that are important things that are important to will take precedence. So we understand that we're striving for balance, but we understand that it's a continual process. And sort of piggybacking on that, I think it's also really helpful to remember that there really is no such thing as zero risk. Life is risky, and within a system of supports, there are risks that we can support, and there are absolutely risks that we cannot support. And our role is to kind of help sort through that, look for that balance between important to and important for, and help the person and their family and their care providers and care partners and caregivers, supporters, whoever it is that's engaged with that person, understand from the system perspective what risks we can support and what risks we can't, and sort of the why behind that, but to also really help that person be comfortable with taking some risk or continuing to do some things that they've always done in their life that we may be a little anxious about and a little worried about, but we recognize, again, there is no such thing as zero risk, okay? So let me just talk a little bit about important to and kind of the definition of what we mean by this. Again, this is the framework we're using for this presentation. And this comes from the Learning Community for Person-Centered Practices, and you'll hear a little bit more about that further into the presentation. When we talk about important to, we are talking about the elements that contribute to all of us. So this is not just about somebody who lives with a diagnosis of dementia. This is really about human beings. But it's the elements that contribute to the person feeling happy, satisfied, fulfilled, comforted, and content in their life. And those, typically for most people, those things include relationships, identity, culture, having purpose and meaning in the person's life, having some status and control, personal belongings, treasures, things to hang on to, places to go, activities to do, or not, I should say, that the or nots are equally important in this. Rituals and routines, honoring those things that bring comfort and familiarity to the day, the way you wake up, the way you drink your tea, the order in which you get dressed, the order in which you just walk through your morning activities, where the things go in your kitchen cabinet, the way you get ready for bed at night. All of those things are part of our rituals and our routines. The way we celebrate birthdays or anniversaries, the way we grieve, the way we want to be treated when we're sick. All of those are part of our rituals and routines. And then rhythm and pace of life. So all of those pieces, all of those elements contribute to what we define as important to, understanding what is important to the person. In addition to that, we want to recognize that we have to pay attention to quality of life, and quality of life is defined by the person. And that can be difficult because people may choose to live in ways that we might not choose to. And so we have to be really, really careful about that kind of stepping back and saying, I personally might choose to do it differently, but this isn't about me. This is about this person. So quality of life is defined by the person. Important too, how the person communicates, how they can be heard, how they need to be listened to. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on that today. In particular, what people say with words and what people say with their action or their behavior. And when words and action conflict with each other, so when somebody continues to tell us one thing, but they continue to do another, we have to ask why. That's a cue to us to dig deeper and to really explore a bit. As you know, some people have really learned to give an answer that is kind of considered the right answer or the answer that they think somebody else wants to hear, but it may not really reflect what's important to the person. So when somebody says one thing but continually does another, our job is to explore why. We are balancing important to with important for. And one of the important messages in this is that sequence really matters. And so we always start with important to. If we try to support, if we start with important for, we kind of get stuck. It's really easy to get stuck in a conversation, kind of a circular conversation about it's not healthy, it's not safe, therefore we can't do it. It's not healthy, it's not safe, therefore we can't do it. It's really important that we start with what's important to the person, and we understand that, and we have a good picture of that, and then we figure out how do we support helping the person stay healthy and safe at the same time that we are supporting what's important to the person. And for us, the definition of important for are the things that others, typically others, see as necessary for the person to be healthy and safe. So that may include prevention of illness or injury, it may include treatment, it may include promotion of kind of typical wellness activities, for example, exercise, eating healthy, but within the person's interest. We want to be, this probably sounds remedial, but it's kind of a friendly reminder that we want to be really clear that promoting activities that the person has no interest in is not likely going to be terribly successful. And so we need to make sure we understand, again, what's important to. Start with that sequence matters. Start with important to. Issues of safety, we want to, again, as we think about important for, those things that others see as necessary. Is the environment where the person spends time generally reasonably safe? Does the person feel free from fear or anxiety or worry? Would others who know and love that person consider them to be physically and emotionally healthy, and are we honoring their well-being? There's also a second part to important for, and that part is what others would say is necessary for the person to be valued or to feel valued in their community and to be a contributing member of their community. You might think about, I think of a quick example I can give you is a situation I observed in a physician's office where an older woman was brought to the physician's office by a care facility, and it was very clear that her clothes were not clean, that she probably had not been helped to bathe in a while, and the doctor was really, really upset about that, and it made sense. You have to wonder, would most of us be comfortable going out without having our clothes clean and our hair fixed? And particularly if we are, for example, struggling with urinary incontinence. So as I think about important for, we also want to consider those things that that we know really help that person feel valued and welcome in their community. So this is really the kind of linchpin of this that I want to spend a couple of minutes on. I feel like I'm kind of walking through the rest of these pretty quickly, but important to and important for are connected to each other. It's critical for us, it's important for us to remember that almost nobody, almost none of us, will do things that are important for us, those things around our health and our safety, unless they matter to us. If they're not important to us, if there's not some element of important to, we're very unlikely, at least without coercion or for any long period of time, to do something that is important for us. So that notion of balance, achieving balance as we're talking about, is dynamic. And we have to remember that there are always trade-offs. There are trade-offs between the things that we identify as important to, and there are trade-offs between 2 and 4. So you might look at your closet and say, you know, I really love navy blue pants. It's important to me. My favorite work outfit. But do I really need 7 pairs of them? And maybe you do. That's you get to make that decision, right? But sometimes there are trade-offs between those. It's important to me to have a good, a diverse wardrobe, a good work clothes wardrobe. Maybe I won't go buy 1 more pair of blue pants. There's also trade-offs between important to and important for. So sometimes the thing that matters to us requires us to kind of stop and take a break and pay more attention to the thing that's important for us. And I'll give you a real-life example of that. I had the opportunity to support a woman who lived with a hoarding disorder. And because her house was so full of stuff, so chock full of stuff, trash, broken appliances, just over-the-top knickknacks all over the place. Because of that, her adult children no longer came to visit. Her adult children said, we can't spend time in your house. It doesn't work for us. She would tell you that seeing her family was important to her, but she needed significant support around her hoarding diagnosis. And if her children were going to come visit, it meant cleaning up the house. And she was often reluctant, very reluctant, to accept any support. And so there was this tug of war, this push-pull between I want to see my children, it's important to me, but living someplace that's healthier and safer is probably also important for me, and I'm going to need support to do that. And so finding balance required figuring out support for the hoarding diagnosis, as well as figuring out what the boundaries were for her adult kids to visit. And yes, they could visit elsewhere. They could go out to eat, or they could go to a park or something. But for this woman, having them visit her home was really important to her as well. Having her kids see that she could manage her disorder was really important to her as well. And so the trade-off was accepting some support for her hoarding diagnosis and literally accepting some support for kind of getting her house in some manageable order so it was both safe for her but also such that her adult children could come visit. And then important too, getting to spend time with her adult children. So there's always trade-offs. The other thing is that, you know, if you could see me right now, you would see that I had my hands in front of me, and that kind of motion we use when we're talking about a scale. So you have your hands in front of you, palms up, and kind of one hand goes up and one hand goes down. It's kind of a seesaw. Important to and important for is never perfectly balanced. It's rare that at any point in time for any of us, everything is just in perfect balance. It's very much a gradient, up and down, back and forth. The thing to recognize is that sometimes the scales will tip very heavily one way or the other, most often to the important for side, depending upon circumstances. If, for example, somebody develops a critical illness, or becomes critically ill. There's a period of time in there with a new diagnosis, a breast cancer diagnosis, for example, where all of a sudden people are surrounded by health and health care, and we recognize that at that moment in time, we have to spend a lot of time on what's important for someone. So I'm going to shift to this notion of communication, and we're going to talk about communication today as a tool for discovery. And that discovery process is what will help you figure out what is important to balanced with what is important for. So that's how we're using discovery today, is we're talking about it as a way to understand what matters to someone, so that as you think about goal discovery, you can really begin to focus on identifying activities and goals and outcomes that have interest to people. And as you can see from most of the footers, the content today comes from the Learning Community for Person-Centered Practices. The Learning Community is a worldwide community of practice. We envision a world where all people have positive control over the lives that they choose for themselves. And our focus tends to be on people who have lost or are at risk of losing control because of kind of a systems or society's response to a diagnosis or perceived disability. Specifically today, we're going to talk about the communication chart, and that comes from the Person-Centered Thinking curriculum. And Person-Centered Thinking is a structured set of skills and tools. There are 11 skills and tools in this curriculum that encourage and give us ways to discover, capture, record, and manage supports and services when we are helping somebody really look for and kind of act on that positive control in their lives. There are discovery skills, everyday learning skills, and management skills. And I want you to think about person-centered thinking in sort of two ways. One is it's simply a way to act and engage and behave, right? So it's a way for us to engage and act when we are supporting people who use long-term supports and services. In this case, we're talking about people who live with dementia, but really it could be anybody. And then the second piece is the sort of big P, capital P, capital C, capital T, which is the curriculum, right? So it's a core set of skills and tools designed to help us with that first part, designed to help us with engaging and behaving in a way that, that puts us on that path and supporting that person to positive control. And so our purpose today, obviously, is we're going to review this communication chart. And specifically around the communication tool, we use this as a means really to help us better understand how to engage with someone, right? How to understand why somebody does the things that they're doing, helps create clarity around expectations for us. How should we respond? And it's really designed to create some consistency so that any of us providing support are really clear about how we should act in a situation in a way that makes sense for the person. When we think about communication, if we don't engage with somebody in a way that makes sense to them, if we don't use language that person understands, if we don't, both body language and words, I would say, if we don't engage in a way that's comfortable for the person or that they can understand, part of what we do is we sort of fail to acknowledge the world and the culture that person spends their time in, right? And we have to recognize the role that culture plays in the person's journey. And if we don't, we really do a disservice to that person, to their family, and their care providers. And so it's also important for us to support the intersection of culture and communication and recognize that it's not an either-or, but it really is we have to do both. And that's a great segue to the conversation that Brian is going to have with us. So I'm going to stop here and hand off to Brian Van Buren, who I think is on the phone at this point, and is going to just talk a little bit about his experience living with Alzheimer's disease and some insights around the importance of understanding culture and communication.
Thank you very much. As she mentioned, my name is Brian Van Buren. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I was diagnosed in 2014 with early onset Alzheimer's. My mother died 2 years ago from Alzheimer's, and both my grandmothers died from Alzheimer's, but back then they called it senility. I recall seeing my mother trying to help Grandma Van with bathing and grooming, as she would forget how to complete each task and ask simple questions that even I could answer as a 16-year-old. The sounds grew louder and went back and forth from screaming to laughing, screaming to laughing. What a sound. How was it that one moment she was screaming, twisting, and pulling, and the very next moment she was laughing and playing nice? I watched Grandma Van fight her way through the disease. I witnessed my family struggle to understand the disease process and what to expect. I was forever impacted by seeing this heartless disease rip away pieces of Grandma Van's life as we knew her. I once heard my mom say, who she cared for most of her life, "What's your name?" I watched the hurt on Mom's face as she repeated her name once more. Her heart must have broken to feel as though dear Grandma Van had forgotten their bond. Years later, I began to study the field of aging and dementia, and I learned that my family was not the only family to experience this. There are currently 21% of Black individuals in the United States that are living with Alzheimer's disease or some form of dementia. I learned that the Black folks are diagnosed 2 times greater than our white counterparts. I also learned that in the Black community, Alzheimer's disease is the 4th leading cause of death. In our community, it is a silent epidemic due to cultural associations to a misunderstood condition. Many refer to disease as senility or simple forgetfulness. To my surprise, so many other Black families were faced with the same challenges and remained silent about it due to lack of support, resources, and education about the disease. Like my family, many other Black families received a dementia diagnosis and were sent home packing, looking for answers, and determining to figure it out as a family no matter what. Have you ever had to navigate this disease alone and feel completely lost and confused? I am sure many of you can relate. This is a typical experience for any dementia caregiver. For Black families, however, this is the added weight of dealing with healthcare discrimination and racism, coupled with limited access to dementia care resources. According to the Alzheimer's Association's latest Alzheimer's disease facts and figures, 2/3 of Black Americans believe it is hard for them to get excellent care for Alzheimer's disease or other diseases. Additionally, 50% of Black Americans have reported discrimination when seeking health care and believe discrimination is a barrier to Alzheimer's dementia care. If these numbers do not rock you, then I challenge you to dig deeper. It makes a difference when you enter the hospital and fear that your loved one may not get adequate attention and care, all because of your racial identity. That fear is compounded if your loved one is alone and not able to verbalize their concerns. Jean Fry, a fervent caregiver for her late husband, David, can relate to the experiences that I have gone through as well as my family. Jean shared caring for her husband living with dementia. It was no easy feat, and many times she felt completely isolated from medical support and community. One afternoon, in utter frustration, I took my cell phone and went over to Starbucks, ordered a coffee, sat down with a stack of local dementia care resources, and I started calling through a long list, which I soon realized was that the long list did not include any resources for Black families and caregivers. I need someone who looks like me. Shortly after Jean and I connected at the Alzheimer's Association Health number, we met in the spring of 2015, sharing a common interest in dementia caregiving. Me holding the memories of my grandma Van close to my heart, and Jean making her way through her day-to-day caregiving journey. We both wanted to connect to more Black families and caregivers alike. We had a passion to create our own dementia for us, by us. Jean advocated fiercely to the local Alzheimer's Association chapter at her church and to the community. With Jean's efforts and a lot of planning, we started the African American Caregivers Support Group, the first of its kind in the Charlotte region, a safe place where Black folks could gather, share similar lived experiences, become educated about the disease, and get connected to meaningful resources. Our group is currently meeting virtually and is open to Black caregivers across North Carolina. Updated meeting information can be found monthly online. Since our support group has grown to a roster of 75 individuals. Why? Because a large number of Black caregivers are in desperate need of valuable support and education. The numbers continue to grow. Black caregivers are in search of a space that is familiar and safe, as identified in the report. Black caregivers want to feel confident that they have access to quality dementia care and health care providers who will understand their racial background and needs. The report further explains that Black caregivers do not feel that health care providers empathize with them and their experiences. A staggering 89% of Black Americans say it is important for Alzheimer's and dementia care providers to understand their ethnic or racial background and experiences, yet only 48% feel confident. It is clear that racial disparities exist within the dementia Alzheimer's care. It is critical to begin understanding how Black families experience discrimination and do access to quality health care and support. Thank you.
This is Leanne. Thank you, Brian. We really appreciate your insights on that and your experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'd like to, in just a moment, we'd like to share a video with you. I'd like to just give you a little bit of context for it. You know, I think, again, if we think about this notion of honoring the spectrum, right, honoring the continuum of this journey that people are on, it's really easy when you know somebody has a dementia diagnosis, particularly if you've not met somebody. I think it's really easy to create an image in our head of what that person might sound like or how they may engage with us or not engage with us. And part of what person-centered thinking does and person-centered practices really do is ask us to sort of challenge those assumptions. And if we're going to put in place practices that really help someone gain or regain positive control in their life, then we have to, again, with some balance, kind of get out of the way if we can. And one of the ways to do that is to kind of take a step back and really challenge our assumptions and see if what we think is true perhaps maybe is not true. And so we're going to share a video with you. You're going to hear Elias Rodriguez sharing a story. Elias is a nurse that works at the community, or he works as the community life director at Roundtree Gardens in Orange County, California. And it's just a wonderful story, I think, about this notion of communication. And when we listen to people and we really engage with people in a way that makes sense for them, people will communicate differently. And people may communicate in ways that we had not imagined previously. Rob, I'm going to hand.
Yeah, I remember having a pretty powerful experience. Like Dr. Cameron Camp said, it's changing the way that you think, which also changes the way that you approach different situations. And I remember we had a reading group, and we had, I think it was 8 community members, residents, that were lined up, all persons living with dementia. And we were going to have a reading group, and they were randomly selected. And Dr. Cameron Camp didn't have any background on any of them. So one of the community members there, we had assumed for a few years that didn't speak and couldn't really understand or hear what we were saying. And so, you know, they were part of the group, and we thought, okay, well, you know, let's see how this goes. And what happened was they gave each of them a book or a pamphlet that had large print, spaced out, easy to read booklets. And to everyone's absolute shock, not only did she read it, but she read it beautifully. We hadn't even heard her voice before. And it was as though the way in which we were communicating, we thought had to be auditory. We'd have to have a verbal response. Reading turned out to be something that she really enjoyed. And so we started writing communication and getting responses. It was jaw-dropping. That experience was pretty eye-opening as well. Thinking differently, approaching differently, maybe doing something we hadn't really thought of is trying to use multiple different ways of communicating versus saying, oh, well, they can't really respond when I ask them a question, which is what, you know, I think was the way it was approached in the past before kind of this person-centered. So I'd say that some of the things that changed were the way to approach, the way to ask questions, the way to think. And so some of the strategies have been preparing that environment, making it a opportunity for success, as high an opportunity for success as possible. And that's in knowing that individual and making it person-centered and personalized for them to give them the best opportunity for success.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for queuing up the video. Unfortunately, we don't have time to dig into it a whole lot, but I would love in the chat, if you've got comments about this or thoughts on this, feel free to put them into chat. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful story. And again, I think it's just a really good example of when we don't necessarily make an assumption, and when we engage differently and we listen differently, that people will communicate with us differently, and certainly often very differently than we expected. All right, so I'm going to go to the next slide here. So in a minute, I'm going to show you a communication tool developed for a woman who is living with dementia. Her name is Paulina. But what I wanted to show you here was a little bit more about Paulina. And so this is Paulina's one-page description or one-page profile. You can certainly develop a communication chart without a one-page description, but it is really helpful to have an understanding of what's important to the person and to really understand a little bit more about the person when you are using a communication chart. And in Paulina's case, I've highlighted some information in red. So under what others like and admire about her, you see that she's a great storyteller, and she loves to tell you all about her grandchildren. She has a fantastic memory for recipes. You see under what's important to her, again, storytelling about her family, her escapades, her life in the Foreign Service. She has some really, really amazing stories. Best supports. Now, this is not a clinical document that is going to give you pages and pages of everything you need to know. This is really quick snapshot in time, okay? One of the best supports for Paulina. If she's having a difficult moment, if she's really upset about something, sometimes you can help her refocus and kind of help her shift whatever at the moment may be distracting and bothering her. If you ask her a question about her grandchildren or ask her to teach you or tell you how to cook something, and if you notice, that connects right back to what's important to her, it connects right back to what others like and admire, and it's a really useful tool for us as supporters. So this is what a one-page profile looks like. In your handout packet, we've given you several examples. You've got Paulina's, you've got JT's, and then you also have one for a woman named Ruth. And we just wanted to share some of those examples with you. But I'm going to show you Paulina's communication chart. And this was developed after, I think, sort of as she was moving into assisted living, sort of in process. And it was some information that her family shared that they thought would be really helpful to share with staff. And we'll walk through in just a moment kind of the process of developing a communication chart. But essentially, the information here, what a communication chart or tool does for us is it captures for us what's happening, kind of what's going on around the person at that moment, what the person's doing, and it takes a guess at what we think that means. Sometimes people use lots of words to communicate with us, and that meaning might be more clear, but sometimes it's not. And then really importantly, it tells us what to do, right? How do I respond? How do I communicate with the person when this is happening? So I'm going to focus for just a moment on this second line here where Paulina is talking, she's having a conversation with you, she's telling you a story about her life. And what you hear is that she's using sort of nonsense words, or she might be saying things that either sound nonsensical or it's hard to figure out really what they mean. For example, she has this wonderful story about the Prime Minister bringing blueberries for breakfast. Here's what we know. One is that she may just not remember the right word. So she might use a nonsense word because she doesn't remember the correct word to use. But at that moment, it seems right to her. Her inflection and her tone are almost always right. So you get a sense of if she's happy or she's stressed or she's worried. Her tone of voice is almost always accurate. But the other thing is that often if you hear her telling you something that sounds a bit nonsensical, there's often a kernel of truth kind of buried in there. And what we should be doing is, unless it really, really matters, we don't need to correct her. She'll ask for the correct word if she wants it. And the other thing is just go with it. Just enjoy the story that she's telling you. The Prime Minister and Blueberry story is actually a true story, but you have to know a little bit more about her life in the Foreign Service to sort of understand all of the context for that. And if she just starts telling you out of the blue, it can often sound a bit farcical. So let me show you a communication chart really quickly. And there's essentially 4 questions here, or 4 statements. This is happening. The person does this. We think it means, and we should do. That's the foundation for the communication chart, okay? And even though all of us probably learn to read left to right, we're going to mess with that a bit, and we're going to ask you, if you are filling this out, to start with the person does this column. That tends to be the easiest, clearest set of information for people to gather. It's observable, you can hear it, you can see it, you can feel it, so it's helpful really to start with that second column, the person does this, and then jump back to sort of when does this happen? What is going on around the person? What was taking place or is taking place in the environment when you see that, okay? So you've got the person does this, this is when it's happening. The third piece of that is, what is your best guess about what it means? And we use the language of we think it means because unless the person is capable of telling you, if they can say to you, when I do this, this is what it means, then you're really solid. But otherwise, we're taking a guess, particularly if it's not something the person can really explain to us. So we want to just respect that. And so we have the person is doing something, here's what's happening, here's when we see it occurring, and here's our guess at what we think it means. Here's what the person is trying to tell us. This is all really grounded in this belief that behavior is communication. And the last piece is, once we know what the person's doing and why it's happening or when it typically happens and what we think it means, the last piece is, here's what we should do. Here's how we should respond, okay? So if I go back for just a moment to Paulina's, you see then anytime the observable behavior, she's pulling at her clothing as if to take it off or as if it's irritating her, that can happen anytime. We think it means that she's either too warm, she's hot, the fabric is bothering her, or she's itchy, but it may bother her enough that she can't say to you, I'm itchy and I want to take this off, and she has been known to just be anywhere, sometimes in a parking lot, and try to start taking her clothes off because they're really bothering her. For Paulina, if you can get to a public restroom, you're at the mall or somewhere, and you can get to a bathroom pretty quickly and get in a stall, she can usually get the offending clothing off and not then be at risk for standing, in public, taking her clothes off. So that's the sequence. You start with the person does this, this is happening, we think it means, and we should do. Okay, and I'm going to hand off for a moment to Shawn Terrell from ACL to talk a little bit about this one-page profile and the communication chart.
Thank you. Okay, I hope everybody can hear me all right. Shawn Terrell, thanks for joining us here, and thanks for giving me a few minutes here to talk about JT. Or John. In this case, it says John's one-page description. We would call him, he's my father, by the way, just for full disclosure, JT or John. And so his one-page description, we use this for, all aspects of his support for dementia. The person is small, one-bedroom apartment where he, we really needed 24/7 support, and so we started with home health, and that just did not work in a very tiny place, and it was just too much, he's bumping into people all the time, and it wasn't working. So he had already expressed to us a assisted living where he would want to go if he needed that kind of support. Plus, it was outrageously expensive paying out of pocket for home health, and so we went to a memory care unit, and we built this for the home health agency, but also brought it with us to the home health agency. And I think I can do let me point out just couple of things. I mean, it's the same structure as Leigh, it's the same approach using what's important to me, people who support me best. And some of the stuff we're going to talk about with the communication chart that I'll just show you a brief piece of our communication chart for John. Which are reflected in the one-page description include things like being polite and have manners, understanding what's going on, he's really liked to have a lot of time to himself. He really had no problem living by himself for many years. And that he doesn't like a lot of over-enthusiasm. He likes a lot of calm and sort of, not a lot of surprises. So that's going to be important in the communication chart. When we sat down with the folks at the, next slide. We sat down with the folks at the, both places actually, both groups, the home health and the assisted living place. So we explained to him like what is in this communication chart essentially, which is, if we start with the second box, as Leanne pointed out, what he does, right? He gives somebody a stern look or yells at him, right? Usually the stern look comes first. But what does that mean, right? What does a stern look actually look like? Hard to describe. And what's happening, though, is somebody's in his space, like he's feeling like there's too much, activity, or somebody's too close, or someone's talking to him in a way that's not, he doesn't feel is very respectful, or is too forward. And so he'd ask them, ask them to leave or leave alone, and then they, but they persist, okay? So then you start getting a look, which we as kids all know what that meant, but it was hard to, as kids, but it's hard to explain. And then, but really what it means is he's telling them they need to be left alone. And sometimes that's expressed in an angry way. And what that means to do in the fourth box, what J2 would like us to do, is to very respectfully help him leave the situation. Offer, ask he wants to go for a walk, does he want something to eat, does he want to go somewhere else, in a very gentle and calm manner. And just a quick sort of story on this is we explained all this and had this communication chart. After sort of discussions around him coming into the place, the assisted living place, and the general response was from the staff and the people, they were like, oh yeah, no problem, we got no problem, we're good at this, we're going to do it. And then we said, okay, we just want to make sure, because for us, and this is for John and for us and for everybody involved, it's important for John and important to John that he stay there, that he allowed, that if he works out, that this is the place where he wanted to be, and that we wanted this to be successful, right? We wanted to make sure that they were aware of some of these issues so that he could, they could respond appropriately and not escalate and et cetera, and have challenges. So it was only after they saw it. So we put this in there, so we presented this to him, and then they recognized this. But after it happened, they're like, oh, this is what the family was talking about. And that sort of triggered that, oh, let's go look at that chart. It sort of was there, but they weren't fully cognizant of it until it happened. Then they sort of remembered. So even that was really helpful. I think a successful approach to introducing a communication that was important for everybody involved, a communication style and a response. So thank you.
This is Leanne. Thanks, Shawn. And just to let folks know that there is a more complete, with more information, communication chart for JT in that PDF packet that we gave you that includes Paulina's one-page profile and communication chart, JT's one-page description and communication chart, and then also for a woman named Ruth, who we didn't talk about here today. We just wanted to give you another example of an older adult. So, all right, well, we're going to wrap up here and go to questions, but just some key takeaways, kind of a wrap-up for us to remember that really this is a continual process. Good person-centered practices means we never stop. We're always striving for balance. If we're going to think about, if we're going to use communication charts, understand that it is grounded in the belief that all behavior is communication, and our role obviously is to listen and observe and try really, really hard continually, because it's not always easy and we don't always get it right the first time, to try really hard to understand what the person is sharing with us. Our experience tells us that when we honor someone's communication and culture, when we listen well, when we respond in ways that the person needs us to respond, that people will start communicating with us in different ways, new ways, different ways, possibly more than they have previously. And one of my favorite quotes that comes from Teepa Snow, just kind of a friendly reminder that a person with dementia is not giving you a hard time, but they are having a hard time. I think it's a really nice way to kind of capture the experience that many of us have had. So I'm going to stop there and hand it back to Sari.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for your wonderful presentations. We're going to move to questions at this time. So we've had some come in. I just want to start with, this one is for you, Leanne. Someone has asked, and potentially Shawn as well, what kinds of techniques have you used to get staff and trainers to focus on the important two instead of just focusing right on setting up health, welfare, and safety protocols?
Right. Shawn, do you want me to start? Do you want to start?
Go ahead. You go ahead. Go ahead. I don't know if I need to.
Okay. Thanks for the question. So the very broad answer is, and this is really not exactly an answer, but I'll whittle down to it, the very broad answer is that implementing person-centered practices is really about changing your culture of care, changing the way an organization engages and provides care. And I think probably the best experience that we have is, and this is going to sound like a marketing ploy, and it's not meant to be at all, but the person-centered thinking training that I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar is a highly interactive, highly experiential training, and our experience is that people seem to grasp the concepts the best when they have a chance to really get, you know, kind of elbow deep into them and practice them and work on them, use the skills and tools really in their own lives and with their own experiences. And the training allows people to do that. And I think that's where we often see those kind of light bulbs go off where people say, oh, wait a minute, I see how that works in my own life. How would that work in the life of somebody I support? I think the other thing, too, is that, again, my statement that sequence matters is always going back to when somebody presents you with a health and safety issue, is acknowledging that and saying, okay, let's hold on to that for a second. What do we know first about what's important to this person? And really, really get that that list together, get that, you know, a really solid understanding of what's important to the person, and then begin to have the conversation about, okay, we also need this person to be as healthy and safe as possible. How can we do that and support the important twos?
Shawn, anything you want to add?
Well, other than I totally agree. I think, you know, it is really good to have, as you point out on the culture side, to help sort of in any organization that's sort of working in this space. You learn a skill like communication chart. How would you work that into your organizational structure? You know, how can you support it? How can you have, you know, sort of build in this into the discussions that you have around the work you're doing around important to as really important. I mean, the fact of the matter is most of the stuff that you get when you from a family member perspective is you get the important for stuff. Everybody's kind of got pretty good clarity on that. But the important too is the hard part, and the part that's not always easily grasped or felt or even felt important to the people providing the support, right? It's sort of a paradox. So, you know, the conscious effort needs to be made, and I think, you know, any kind of training, any kind of practice and training can help.
Great, thank you. Brian, anything you want to add on this question?
No.
Okay, great. Let's continue. It looks like there's quite a few questions that get at the issue of balancing risk and how do you balance the important for with the important to. Similar to what you just responded to, but really with that emphasis on making sure the person is safe while balancing that risk to allow the person to do some of those important twos.
Right. Right. I have to tell you, I could do an entire webinar on this. This is probably one of my favorite topics. I really love digging into this, and we have about 3 minutes, so we won't dig very deep. But first is, again, sequence matters. So you have to start with the important twos, and that assumes. Let me say that this assumes that the risk that we are talking about is not in our face at the moment with the person about to do something that is life-threatening to themselves or someone else. So, in those circumstances, obviously, we jump in, we prevent somebody from being seriously hurt or injured, and then we have the opportunity to look back and go, okay, how do we, let's think about this going forward. How do we prevent this, and what are we doing that isn't supporting important two, and that sort of allows us to continue. So we start with the important twos. And then we really look at what's the purpose of. We have to really think about that communication chart again. What's the purpose of the thing? I'm gonna say action or behavior for that person that's creating the risk. So they are trying to continually leave the building. They are trying to continually. They eat food too fast. Is it an intentional action on the person's part that is a way of them communicating something, that tells us, I need to do something, I need you to do something, or is it an action or a behavior that maybe isn't intentional or willful, but just is how this person kind of operates in their world? And then the question becomes, are there places where that action or that behavior, in fact, would not be risky? It's almost sort of a harm reduction kind of approach. Are there times, are there places where whatever it is that person is trying to do, they, in fact, could be supported to be safe in doing it? And again, that's so much more than a one-shot conversation. The other question, I think, is who is it, if you will, and again, this requires much more conversation than we have time for, but who is it risky for? Is it risky for the person? Is it risky for the people around the person? Is it seen as risky by the person's family and loved ones? And how do we have conversations about you as the daughter who loves your dad might see this walking out the door to take a walk in the garden as risky. We see, as the place where your dad's living, we see locking the door and keeping him inside as more risky, right? And the garden is safe. The garden is locked, and he's not going to walk down the street, and he can't get away from the building. But we're not. We think that it's a greater risk to tell him he can't go outside than it is for him to go outside. And so I think there's also then, from a starting point, there's a place where you start to say, who's the risk, or who is worried about the risk, and what can we do to address it with that person? Because what the person living with dementia sees as risky and what others see as risky may be very, very different.
Great, thank you so much. Shawn or Brian, anything to add?
None here, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, we are just about out of time here. I see a lot of questions coming in asking where to access the slides and the PDFs. Those should be under resources on the webinar platform you're looking at, and quite a few questions about whether the session is being recorded. It is being recorded and will be posted on the NADRC and ASA websites as soon as we are able to get it posted. If you have questions or concerns about that, you can reach out to me. I will put my information in a response and send it out to all of you. I want to thank you all for attending today, and thank you to the presenters. We really appreciate your time and all the information you shared. Please join us for the next National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar on June 23rd on elder abuse in people living with dementia, considerations for prevention, detection, and intervention. The registration information for that webinar is on the ASA website. I will turn it back to Rob Lowe for some final remarks. Rob, anything to add for the end of the session here? Looks like Rob has an audio glitch. So I believe you will all get the continuing education information if you are applying for those credits in your email by the end of the day. And we thank you again for attending. We hope to see you again on June 23rd. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.